How did Muhammad die? What were the circumstances of his death? Where was he buried? That's going to be the subject of our video today.
According to various Islamic traditions, Muhammad died due to the work of Zainab bint al-Harith, and the story is quite convincing, at least on a superficial level. So, for example, we have details about her when she died 628. She was a Jewish woman. She lived in Khaybar, Arabia, so on. There's a whole host of information supposedly about her. We have her parents' names, her brothers, her husband, her children, and so on. Had this been written in the 21st century, we probably have been given her full dental records, her driving license, her TV license, and numerous other details as well. I think they went a bit too far with the details, considering this supposedly is just a random person that kills Muhammad, and yet we seem to know more about her than more significant people in the whole story. And also bearing in mind that the Islamic traditions haven't managed to get the year of Muhammad's death correct, which was probably done intentionally, but nonetheless. So we have a whole backstory to her, that she came from Yemen. I'm not going to go into the details. I think suffice to say that I consider this to be an elaborate hoax, elaborate fiction. Nonetheless, it's probably worth taking a look at some of the versions of this story, and then we'll compare it to what we can actually find from more dependable early sources, some of which predate these stories by a century, which consider to be more reliable as a result. Okay, so a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawood says the following, narrated Ibn Shihab. Jabir ibn Abdullah used to say that a Jewess from the inhabitants of Khaybar poisoned a roasted sheep and presented it to the Messenger of Allah, who took its foreleg and ate from it. A group of his companions also ate with him. The Messenger of Allah then said, "Take your hands away from the food." The Messenger of Allah then sent someone to the Jewess, and he called her. He said to her, "Have you poisoned this sheep?" The Jewess replied, "Who has informed you?" He said, "This foreleg which I have in my hand has informed me." She said, "Yes." He said, "What did you intend by it?" She said, "I thought if you were a prophet it would not harm you. If you were not a prophet, we should rid ourselves of him, i.e. the prophet." The Messenger of Allah then forgave her and did not punish her, but some of his companions who ate it died. The Messenger of Allah had himself cupped on his shoulder on account of that which he had eaten from the sheep. Abu Hind cupped him with the horn and knife, and he was a client of Banu Bayada from the Ansar. This is according to Sunan Abu Dawood 39, 44, 95. There's lots of things wrong with the story. There's a really obvious intention to tell a story which has anti-Semitic elements to it, which automatically, in some people's minds, will make it more believable, because the paranoia about the Jews would lead some people to say, it must be true. But there's an obvious thing. Muhammad supposedly has besieged Khaybar, and yet he accepts a meal from his arch enemy. Makes no sense. Even if Muhammad didn't have the judgment to refuse the meal, surely there was someone among his companions with the brain power to see that this was dangerous. And in addition to that, he has a load of wives who are more than happy, supposedly, to cook him a meal. He doesn't need to be accepting random donations of food like this. So it's not very plausible, is what I'm saying. Let's have another look in the Islamic tradition. There's hadiths attributed to Aisha and Anas ibn Malik as well that mention that Muhammad believed that poison was the cause of excruciating pain. Bishir, the mother of the Muslim man who also died eating poison, came to the Prophet during his illness and said, "O Apostle of Allah, I never saw fever like it in anyone." The Prophet said to her, "Our trial is double, and so our reward in heaven is double. What do the people say about it?" She said, "They say it is pleurisy." Thereupon the Apostle said, "Allah will not like to make his Apostle suffer from it, because it indicates the possession of Satan, but my disease is the result of the morsel that I had taken along with your son." Alright. Some hadiths mention the effects of the poison. For example, narrated Aisha, the Prophet in his ailment in which he died used to say, "O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison," which is from Sahih Bukhari 559 713. How can one doubt the credibility of these stories? Surely it must be true. Ibn Ishaq states that she considered if he was a real prophet, he will be informed of her deed, and Muslims believed that the poisoning led to Muhammad's death. When the Apostle had rested, Zainab, the wife of Salam, prepared for him a roast lamb, having first inquired what joint he preferred. When she learned that it was the shoulder, she put a lot of poison in it and poisoned the whole lamb. Then she brought it in and placed it before him. He took hold of the shoulder and chewed a morsel of it, but he did not swallow it. Unfortunately, many Muslims did swallow this story, but anyway. Bishir, who was with him, took some of it as the Apostle had done, but he swallowed it, while the Apostle spat it out, saying, "This bone tells me that it is poisoned." Then he called for the woman, and she confessed, and when he asked her what had induced her to do this, she answered, "You know what you have done to my people. I said to myself, if he is a king, I shall ease myself of him, and if he is a prophet, he will be informed of what I have done." So the Apostle let her off. Bashir died from what he had eaten. So there's a lot of problems with this. It's not credible that he just simply said, "Oh, that's all right," and let her off. It's also not credible that he would have accepted a meal from a random person in enemy territory and so on. It's just not credible. Marwan B. Uthman blah 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 told me the Apostle had said in his illness of which he was to die, when Bashir blah 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 came to visit him, "O Bashir, this is the time in which I feel a deadly pain from what I ate with your brother at Khaybar." The Muslims considered that the Apostle had died as a martyr, in addition to the prophetic office with which God had honoured him. So you can see what they're trying to present here is everything about Muhammad is honourable. He let the woman who killed him supposedly off the hook, so very honourable. He died as a martyr, and this adds to his glory in terms of his prophetic office, which is demonstrated in him being able to prophetically say, "This bone tells me that it is poisoned." So it's clearly a made-up story. Another version says that when she attempted to kill him, Muhammad declared that Allah wouldn't allow her. However, it still left an effect on his mouth. So even that would suggest that he wasn't a prophet if the story were true. But nonetheless, Anas reported that a Jewess came to Allah's messenger with poisoned mutton. Notice now it's mutton. For those who don't know the difference, lamb is a young sheep, mutton is an old sheep. So they haven't got that detail right. And he took of that what had been brought to him. When the effect of this poison were felt by him, he called for her and asked her about that, whereupon she said, "I had determined to kill you." Thereupon he said, Allah will never give you the power to do it. He, the narrator, said that they, the companions of the Holy Prophet, said, should we not kill her? Thereupon he said, no. He, Anas, said, I felt the effects of this poison on the uvula of Allah's Messenger. That's from Sahih Muslim 26:54-30. And then there's also other traditions that ascribe the blame generally on Jews of Khaybar for trying to poison Muhammad. So there's not a lot of credibility in these various accounts. It's just not plausible.
There are 11 early sources for Muhammad's story, which predate the Islamic ones, in some cases by as much as a century. And these don't tally with the traditional Islamic account. After Ibn Ishaq's account was established, and later Ibn Hisham's, the earliest sources seem to fade from memory, and the Islamic tradition became fully accepted. But even in some later Christian accounts, there are still elements of that earlier tradition in evidence. One example of that is Theophanes' Chronicle, referred to sometimes just simply as the Chronicle, written in Greek. It's from the beginning of the 9th century. And in general, he follows the Islamic tradition, so he's correcting the earlier Christian historical tradition about Islam. But one little detail gets through the net, if you like. He relates that Muhammad's life ended with his slaughter or wounding. Doesn't give us much detail there, but could this anomaly perhaps suggest some vestige of an earlier tradition that Muhammad died in battle, possibly leading his followers in the conquest of the Holy Land? That suggestion was made by Stephen J. Shoemaker in The Death of the Prophet, and I think that is very credible. Muhammad, from 11 early sources, and these sources I will endeavour to make a video about later, indicates that in the final years of Muhammad's life, he was at the forefront of the invasion into Palestine. In one source, he even is mentioned bowing in Jerusalem. So we have that, but we also get some other intriguing details which I want to recount. So if we bring together these various different early sources, we find a very different account to that of the poison lamb story. Interestingly, in the poison lamb story, there are some details that we can see in the alternative account that the earliest Christian sources give us. So, for example, there is a meal involved. The meal that I'm going to tell you about is actually quite shocking. Before we get to two accounts about what happened after Muhammad died, I would like to refer back to Shoemaker's book. He says, in a report assigned to Ka'b al-Akbar, a legendary bearer of Jewish lore in the early Islamic tradition, Ibn Sa'd identifies Mecca as the place of Muhammad's birth, Medina as the place of his migration, and interestingly for us, Syria as the land of his rule. Although it certainly is possible that this tradition merely reflects the eventual dominion of Muhammad's rulers in Syria shortly after his death, this notice that Muhammad ruled over Syria is rather intriguing in light of the information from those 11 sources that I have made reference to. Indeed, it would appear from that there's a suggestion that rule over Syria was one of the hallmarks, indeed the climax of Muhammad's career, while other tendencies may have inspired this formulation. One certainly should not exclude the possibility that this report bears witness at greater distance to an earlier tradition associating Muhammad with the conquest of Sirah, Palestine. So, there are, as we said, a few Christian reports from the 8th or 9th century that in fact purport to describe the events of Muhammad's death. I'm eager to share these with you. As one might expect, these accounts are highly polemical, offering narratives of Muhammad's demise that have been deeply coloured by the Christian imagination. One of these, the Latin Historia de Muhammad, is a brief biography of Muhammad that seems to have come into circulation in Spain sometime prior to the middle of the 9th century, when Eulogius of Cordova incorporated it into his Liber Apologeticus Martyrdom. Interestingly enough, like the sources considered, the Historia of Muhammad also seems to present the Islamic conquest of the Roman Near East within Muhammad's lifetime. This concise Christian life of Muhammad begins with Muhammad as an avaricious usurer whose frequent business travels brought him into contact with Christian communities. After drinking deeply of what he learned from the Christians, Muhammad was approached by the spirit of error in the form of a vulture, who persuaded Muhammad that he was the angel Gabriel and directed Muhammad to present himself to his people as a prophet. Muhammad then began to preach, convincing many to abandon idolatry and ordered them to take up arms on his behalf and to cut down their adversaries with the sword. Then we learn that first they killed the brother of the emperor, who held dominion over the land, and in recognition of the triumph of victory, they established the Syrian city of Damascus as the capital of the kingdom. Immediately thereafter, the Historia continues to describe how Muhammad fabricated the Quran, followed by notice of his somewhat irregular marriage to the wife of Zayd, which took place after he had already subjected her to his lust. Then, with the commission of such a heinous sin, the death of his soul and body approached simultaneously, and this Historia concludes with an account of Muhammad's death. One of the things I would say that in this account there appears to be a mixture of the traditional Islamic account and obviously polemics, but also some other elements which stem from an earlier tradition of what happened. It should be pointed out that some details are not correct. Heraclius' brother Theodore did in fact unsuccessfully lead the defense of Syria, but there is no evidence that he died in battle against the Arabs as suggested by the Historia. And as also should be pointed out, Damascus did not become the Islamic capital until 661. The way it's mentioned there in the account leaves that a bit vague. It kind of suggests it's all within the lifetime of Muhammad, but I think the writer probably intended it to look ahead beyond Muhammad's life. As the Historia continues to relate Muhammad's death, it explains that when he sensed that death had come upon him, immediately after his sin with Zayd's wife, he predicted that he would be resurrected. He predicted that he would be resurrected 3 days after his death by the angel Gabriel. Following his death, Muhammad's followers maintained a vigil, guarding his body and awaiting its resurrection. When 3 days later this did not transpire, Muhammad's body began to stink, and his followers convinced themselves that their presence was preventing the angel's appearance, so they left the body alone, and immediately, instead of angels, dogs followed the stench and devoured his flank. His disappointed followers then buried what was left of the body. I just stop there. I'm quoting from The Death of a Prophet, Stephen J. Shoemaker there, but those are quotes there from that source. That's a real shocker, isn't it? So instead of a glorious burial in Medina, it appears to be that Muhammad died in Palestine, and a good chunk of his body was eaten up by dogs. You think about two traditions in Islam. One is the quick burial of people who die, and the fact that dogs are hated, and we can sort of see a sense of why that might be the case, even though that early tradition, that knowledge was suppressed and lost, but yet those traditions have remained, if that makes sense to you. So that's one account, but actually there is also another account, and even though we might put all of this down to just mere legend, it may be an echo of what happened from the earliest days. The Syriac versions of the Bahira legend, a medieval Christian counter-narrative of Islamic origins, share a similar story, according to which Muhammad declared himself the Paraclete. By consequence, it seems his followers expected that 3 days after his death he would go up to heaven to Christ who sent him. When he died, they brought his body to a large house and sealed it inside. 3 days later, they returned only to find that they could not even enter the house on account of the stench of Muhammad's rotting corpse. Barbara Rojima dates this particular tradition tentatively to the 8th or 9th century, largely on the basis of its similarities to the Historia de Muhammad. It certainly seems possible that a Christian polemical tradition ascribing failed predictions of a bodily resurrection to Muhammad arose quite early, and that this episode from the Hara legend thus bears witness to an early anecdote about the end of Muhammad's life. As much would certainly seem to be suggested by an early Islamic tradition that when Umar initially refused to allow Muhammad's burial after his death, seemingly in hopes of his resurrection, this is from a bona fide Islamic tradition, Al-Abbas intervened to insist on his burial, noting that Muhammad's corpse had begun to stink. So this Islamic tradition seems to confirm those two Christian traditions about the fact that Muhammad's body had reached putrefaction. It leaves out the fact that dogs had a hearty breakfast from his body. Shoemaker says the most striking feature of this alternative account of Muhammad's demise is its indication, in the East Syrian recension at least, that Muhammad's followers do not know anything about his grave, including, one would presume, its location. This feature would seem to suggest a particularly early date for this tradition, some time before the tradition of Muhammad's death and burial in Medina had been well established. More to the point, particularly for present purposes, is that this brief polemical account seems to recall a time when Muhammad's followers were perhaps uncertain as to the location of his grave. It is difficult to imagine a Christian polemicist fabricating such Islamic ignorance concerning the site of Muhammad's death, particularly if the tradition of his death in Medina had already been well established from early on. It is certainly not obvious, for instance, how this would serve the tendencies of this polemic. There is no reason why the location of the house where Muhammad failed to resurrect would need to remain a mystery, and indeed the absence of a known grave could seem to validate an Islamic claim to his resurrection. Admittedly, this source is problematic on a number of fronts, and its polemical character raises substantial questions regarding its reliability. Nonetheless, its suggestion that there was a time when Muhammad's followers did not know the location of his grave is more than a little intriguing, and it certainly adds lateral support to the notion that Muhammad's life may have ended in rather different circumstances than his traditional biographies remember it. So, just to conclude then, can you imagine what a shocker this would have had among the earlier followers of Muhammad? Like, to have your leader not only have failed prophecies about the return of the Messiah, but even his prophecies that he would be resurrected in 3 days' time, to have those clearly not come true, and then worst of all, to have his precious body half eaten by dogs, and also it had gone rotten in 3 days from putrefaction, which is not a good indication of holiness. For those not familiar, there's a very strong early Christian tradition that the bodies of saints are preserved by God, and in fact there's a number of cases down through the centuries of that. So this would have been a slam dunk, not in favour of Muhammad's prophethood, but against it. What are the implications of this? Well, one of the implications of this is that we can see good reasons why Muhammad fell off the radar after his death. There are reports in Islamic tradition that there was apostasy following his death. This story gives a clear reason for that apostasy. There's also good reasons now to understand why the caliphs that followed Muhammad seem to not refer to him in any way. We think of Muawiyah, who doesn't have any reference to him in any official documents or inscriptions. It's like as if Muhammad never existed. Now, I don't understand there are some people out there who would see that as evidence of Muhammad not existing. I would suggest that the evidence is really strong that Muhammad existed, and I think there's good grounds for you to reconsider your position. First of all, there's 11 really strong early traditions. Most of these traditions are not polemical, unlike some that we heard today, and they're very matter of fact. They come before the Islamic traditions that we know of today. I think it serves our purposes better to accept that he was a real person, but to actually explore why it was that the early Islamic tradition sought to create a Walt Disney version of events. And the Walt Disney version, which people like Ibn Ishaq and Bukhara and Abu Dawood and all the other hadith makers and all the rest of it, they had a purpose, and one of the purposes was they had to suppress this early embarrassing tradition of Muhammad above all else. Now, to do that, there's a number of things that they needed to do. They needed to have him die before the conquest of Palestine, so they have him dying in 632. They need to move him as far away from Palestine as possible, because that's the source of the embarrassment. So they have him well down in the middle of Arabia, in a fictional place called Mecca. They even have a story of him being buried in Medina. They have a fictional account of how he died, which has him eating a poisoned piece of lamb. And they even throw in an anti-Semitic element to seal the deal and make it convincing. They have constructed a biography of the woman who poisoned Muhammad. All of this, and many other stories like this, are all designed to bolster the idea that Muhammad was a prophet. The Zayd and Zainab story also serves that purpose. That story is another example of a fictional account that was placed in order to prove that Muhammad was not only a prophet but the last prophet. To do that, they needed to prove that he had no children, whether biological children or children through adoption. And so with this story where he abolishes adoption, they get rid of any possibility of someone claiming that they are descendant of Muhammad, because in the Islamic teaching, prophets inherit their prophethood in a biological sense. Okay, well, I hope you found this video interesting. I certainly found it fascinating finding this out only yesterday, and I was eager to share the news with you. I do highly recommend that you go out and buy The Death of a Prophet. I'm saying this because I'm just finding it such a treasure trove of information. The first 70 pages that I've reached so far have just been utterly fascinating. I do hope to give you a video later at some stage when I get the time, giving you the 11 early sources. So that'll be on the way. Just have a little bit of patience with me. I also want to do future videos on the religious background to Islam, because I think that will be helpful in understanding the big picture. But that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sorry it's a bit of a long one, but I think you probably will appreciate that because of the nature of the information I want to share with you. I want to get everything right, and I want to make sure that you have all the relevant information that you need to make a judgment on this. Alright, goodbye and God bless. Bye.